But a lot of that is because it's for, I guess, a happy reason, and that is that Alberta is attracting a lot of migrants, international and interprovincial. People are moving to Alberta, flocking to Alberta, in fact. And I am, solidly in the camp of we need to act, and we need to act fast and urgently on climate change. Yeah. But I also see the energy companies as they're a big part of the solution, and just 100%. Shutting them down it's not going to work. Actually, we're ever going to stop producing oil and gas, we might find other ways to sequester carbon. Carbon capture and storage, but also direct carbon capture from the air. The technology is very expensive and most of it doesn't work. But that's the beginning of every technology.
You got to learn. Yeah.
You got to learn.
All right, and welcome to the Bold Strong Podcast. I'm your host, Craig Nadeau, and today I have a very special guest with me. We have Todd Hirsch on the program. Very excited to have him. I've known Todd for some time now. We actually went to school together, but we never met each other. Todd is a wonderful individual with a tremendous amount of insights on economics in Alberta and much further abroad. So we're very lucky to have him here. We're going to talk about things going on in Alberta, things going on in Canada, things going on in the U.S. Todd's currently doing keynote speaking across Canada, and look forward to a great conversation. Enjoy. All right, Todd, welcome to the show. So glad to have you. Glad to have you back.
Great to be here. Thanks for having me.
Yeah. So listen, the big deal out there right now is we've had some big elections or some movement and staff, I guess. So, a lot of people are talking, what does that mean to Canada? What does that mean to Alberta? We're in Calgary. What do you think? What's on the horizon for us? Is it going to get better or worse?
I don't think it's an understatement to say this really was an election that will define a generation. And people will have different thoughts, people who like Donald Trump, people who don't like Donald Trump. But it does represent, at least in my mind, and stepping back from some of the other issues and only looking at the economics, this does represent we are entering now a new kind of era. An era where in his first term, Donald Trump maybe didn't have all the people in place. He was sort of new to the job. This time, his second act, he knows exactly what he wants to do. He is stacking his cabinet with people that want to achieve his goals. For Canada, obviously, the big question is, what are these tariffs he keeps talking about? Yeah. And I've been talking about for 6 months previous to the election that we in Canada better get ready, because if he is reelected, and even if he isn't, even if Kamala Harris had won, the U.S. is moving much more protectionist, and that means something for Canada. We don't have to like it, but we have to prepare for it, and we have to be aware this is happening, and we have to go in eyes wide open. With Donald Trump, I don't know. I mean, he said 10% tariffs on everybody, maybe 20%. I don't know. I'm going to go golfing and think about it. And it's left everyone really wondering what's going to happen. And I guess that is part of his style. Maybe his charm. Some people might like that about Donald Trump, that he is, he says outrageous things and he kind of threatens. But say what you want about Donald Trump, but he is not a stupid person. I mean, in some ways his behavior is different, but he knows exactly what he wants to do with these tariffs. He is a transactional individual. In other words, you do something for me and I'll do something for you. And I'm going to use this credible threat of tariffs in order to extract things I want from countries like China, from the EU, and from Canada.
Do you think it means that we'll be renegotiating the North American Free Trade Act?
If we go down that path, I mean, that's one possible thing. The whole thing needs to be renegotiated or up for a renewal in 2026 anyway.
26. Okay.
But other things could happen in the year and a half, between Inauguration Day and middle of 26, when the deal needs to be renegotiated. One of the things that could happen is he says to Canada, hey, look, no one is very happy about your supply management in dairy. And if I were, that industry, and again, people will have different thoughts on if it should be supply managed or not. Yeah. But it has been an irritation for decades, and not just the United States. Around the world, people look at Canada and say, hey, Canada, you say you're all about free trade, but then you've protected your dairy and your cheese and your egg industry. I think that wall is going to come down. That might be one of the things that Donald Trump, and maybe not Trump himself, but his negotiators, they're going to want to see Canada, you do that.
Is it highly subsidized? Is that what the issue is?
Not so much subsidized, but it's protected in the fact that imports of American dairy, cheese, eggs, it doesn't happen. High tariffs.
Oh, okay.
Supply management means that dairy farmers, you have quota. You can't just, if you and I decided, I'm going to become a dairy farmer tomorrow, you can't do it. You got to buy quota.
Oh,
it's a very protected industry. And dairy farmers like it that way. And the dairy industry, they would, if they were on this podcast, they would, trot out all kinds of good reasons, quality issues and safety and supply and security and all these things.
Sure.
The reality is our trading partners hate it. Especially the United States.
More so than even like softwood lumber stuff?
Softwood lumber is also an irritation. That's been an irritation for
a long time.
At least 40 years, maybe longer. That one always kind of flies under the radar screen as well. The softwood lumber trade exists outside of the USMCA trade deal.
Okay. Oh, interesting.
And it's always renegotiated every so often, and the Americans are never happy about it. And wheat used to be the same way until we dismantled the Canadian Wheat Board. That was maybe about 20 years ago already.
That's right.
But that was always an irritation, this single buyer that existed, the Canadian Wheat Board.
Right.
If you were a wheat farmer or a barley farmer in Canada, you had to sell your product to the Canadian Wheat Board.
Right.
And it acted as a bit of a monopoly, or actually a monopsony, the single buyer.
Monopsony, yeah. Wow, that's interesting.
So I think Canada is going to be forced into some uncomfortable negotiations, but hey, that's what being an adult at the table with Donald Trump means.
Yeah.
So I think that there's hope that if we go into this with a transactional Donald Trump back in the White House, saying, hey, look, we don't want a 10% tariff. Your industries, by the way, don't want a tariff on Canadian imports because you depend on us for a lot of things. Let's work out a deal. But I do think we might have to be letting go of things like supply management and dairy.
Well, and I guess anything, when you're dealing with this, Canada's a large business, really. And, we still have to deal with other things like what are we doing with the military? Are we, how do we play in NATO? And Trump is, pushed that one a little bit too.
Absolutely, Trump and the rest of the world. And you got to hand it to them, saying, hey, look, Canada, you are not pulling your weight. Yeah. You want to be a NATO country. Your prime minister said, we're never going to meet our NATO requirements. I think, and especially now that there is sort of more aggressions and military boots on the ground in Europe, NATO suddenly has taken on a whole new importance that didn't exist 10 years ago.
Right.
And I do think there's going to be a lot of pressure on Canada to ante up and meet its 2%.
Yeah, you know what? It is interesting you mentioned that too, because I think NATO at some levels had started to go down the paper dragon road, like where it was just does it mean anything at some point? And a lot of people had questioned whether or not it should stick around.
Yeah,
but suddenly especially
now,
with with what's going on in the Ukraine and Russia, it's suddenly taken a role.
In the 90s, after the fall of the Soviet Union and the Berlin Wall comes down, and suddenly Russia's playing nicely in the sandbox, and they're part of the G8, and even China was playing. It seemed like, hey, we don't really have any common enemies anymore. Capitalism is won. Communism's dead. Everything's great. The 90s really were this golden decade in a lot of ways. I mean, there were wars, what was happening in the Balkans, and there was racism and terrible things happening everywhere. But overall, for global stability and security, the 90s, we had really achieved it. And people were questioning, does NATO, do we still need to be doing all this with NATO? Is it kind of a throwback to the 50s?
Yeah.
But fast forward to 2024, and NATO is, countries like Sweden are scrambling to get into NATO because it's much more important. And I think Canada is going to have to figure out a way, and it's not cheap. We're talking $25 billion extra a year.
Wow.
Some amount like that.
That's
I don't
amazing.
know. Don't quote me
Big
on that
numbers,
number.
but yeah.
Yeah, it's not a rounding error.
Yeah.
Where's that money going to come from?
Yeah.
Pierre Poilievre, who,
Yeah.
you know, if he becomes the prime minister, how's he going to negotiate with a Donald Trump? And where's that money going to come from? Tax increases? No one wants that.
Yeah.
Cuts to spending? There's not, unless you really go heavy on things like old age security or transfers to the provinces, but then you are kicking a hornet's nest you do not want.
Yeah.
So it's going to be fascinating to see how this plays out.
It's gonna be interesting. Yeah, crazy dance.
Yeah, it is.
It'll be it'll be wild. Yeah, it was funny because I remember NATO from. Yeah, I was in the military for a little bit.
Oh, were you?
Yeah.
Okay.
So then, so NATO was. It was there, and we always thought, well, it was one of the interesting components, and this is, you kind of slip away from money, but I always thought, and many others thought, that there was a bit of a marketing issue that NATO had, because NATO was totally fine with the U.S. saying that the U.S. is winning the war that NATO should be fighting. And, like, who wins? Shouldn't it be NATO? Or is it the U.S. winning? Just because U.S. is putting the most money into it, does that mean they win a war? I don't even know. But it was interesting that, I think they need a better marketing campaign.
Well, and it kind of goes hand in hand with the whole stepping back of the United States as the police of the world.
Yeah.
That was the role that after the Second World War, the U.S. was the only superpower left. I mean, the Soviet Union contended for that, and then by the 90s, it was just the U.S., and they were in charge. They sort of maintained global trading routes, made sure commerce took, it's not to say that the U.S. did everything right in global affairs. Of course they didn't. But generally speaking, they maintained order. And now they're sort of stepping back. We saw that in Trump's first term. Biden's term was, it was full of COVID and all kinds of things, but we did see more aggressions militarily in Russia and Ukraine and Middle East. And now we're back to Donald Trump, who has a much more isolationist approach. The U.S. does not need to be solving everyone's problem. He's happy to let strong men around the world, like Xi Jinping and China and Putin, he's prepared to say, hey, they can have their way. They're bullies, and he kind of likes that bully mentality.
Yeah, where he doesn't so Trump is, not calling all the shots. He's not going to be the I'm in charge of the planet type of politician.
And I'd be very concerned, and I'm out of my depth here talking about geopolitics, but I'd be very concerned if I was in Taiwan right now, because I don't know what Trump is going to do with Taiwan if, in fact, China... and they've had they're very clear, they do want China, or they do want Taiwan back as part of China. If China invades, what's Donald Trump going to do?
Yeah.
And it might be a transactional thing,
Yeah.
He's not happy with China and a lot of the economic trade stuff. And he might say to China, hey, China, look, if you play by our rules with trade, we'll turn a blind eye and let you invade Taiwan. I could very easily see him doing something like that.
Yeah, and it is surprising to me that the U.S. gets involved in long, protracted wars where they have this long history of it being very poor results in the end. You just go down this long list of protracted wars that they get into, and it's like, you get into a war with China, like, what are you thinking?
Yeah.
It's not going to go well.
This is not going to end well for anybody.
No, and then, of course, Canada, we end up on their shirt tails a little bit.
That's right.
It's like, well... if the U.S. is doing it, I guess we're in the war too.
And I did read a book recently by Fareed Zakaria, who's the CNN correspondent.
Okay.
I forget the name of the book, but his new book, it's in some ways it's pretty dire, but in other ways he's kind of hopeful, because he says the only thing that's preventing a lot of military aggression between China and the United States is that the two are economically too intertwined.
Yeah, they're tied. Yeah,
they're tied.
Sure. Yeah.
Tied, and that didn't exist. Say, for example, the First and Second World Wars, these countries were not as economically dependent on each other. We didn't depend on China and Germany as much as the United States.
Yeah.
Today, it's very different with China and the United States. Their economies so intertwined that, you can call them an enemy, but military aggression, does that mean we stop importing everything from China?
So that's
and financial markets,
Yeah.
So
It was interesting when it was a kid, when we were kids, we would buy something and look on the bottom of it. It was made in Mexico.
Mexico, yeah.
Like,
or
it wasn't
sometimes
made
Japan.
in China.
Yeah.
Yeah, it was. So it's been a big shift to see everything made in China now.
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah, amazing. So when we look now, okay, well, Canada's got a whole ball of issues that we have to deal with over the next while. And do you feel like we're still coming out of COVID on so many levels? It's like COVID kind of shook us so hard that the dust hasn't settled yet.
I think we are living under the shadow of COVID. Pardon me, my throat. Yeah. We're living under the shadow of COVID that is infiltrating not even just the way we think about our health, but even politically. It really drove a wedge that was already maybe starting to form pre-COVID. Mm-hmm. But COVID really divided people on political and ideological lines, and I think every listener of this podcast would have experienced this, depending on, regardless of which side of the COVID, vaccine or anti-vax or whatever you were, you probably lost some friends over this. It was really sad, the way this all happened. And those two camps then aligned themselves. We saw this more so in the United States, but we see shades of this here in Canada too. Align themselves with political parties, and now there seems to be this almost irreconcilable gap. Mm-hmm. It's hard to have conversations anymore, and that's what I worry about as citizens of a democracy. Have we lost the ability to talk to each other, even people we disagree with?
Yeah. Well, the one of the things that Jordan Peterson's talked about, not extensively, but he's talked about how we get into this groupthink now more so than ever, and how, there's actually studies that go back quite far, sociological studies that say, I'm just going to make up something now, but, in the 50s, you might have an opinion about one social issue, and I might have a totally different opinion, but then we would align on the next opinion, And so, whereas now, when you take the gamut of things that we could have opinions on, it could be abortion and guns and economics and just everything. It tends to be more camped, and so if your opinion is leaning one direction, then all of your opinions possibly or likely would lean that way. Yeah. And that's a different situation now in our world.
And I think to some degree, and I don't know if our political leaders have been the victims of this or if they're the perpetrators, but we live in a political world where if you're in opposition or if you're in government, you cannot agree with somebody across the aisle from you, even if it's a really great idea. Someone in government or opposition might have a really great policy idea, something new. You are required to bat down that idea, because that's the opponent's view, and we can't have conversations, even if it's a great idea.
Yeah.
And I worry about that level of toxicity in our political system.
Yeah, that's a problem.
And I don't know if that's driven, if politicians are responding to voters who like that kind of aggressiveness, or if, in fact, politicians have been sort of foisting it on us, and as a result, we as citizens have become more divided. I don't know.
Well, and it's possible, too, that it's partly the social thing mixed with the new wave of social media and the way we interpret the world. And, there's an awful lot of people. I don't know what the age line is, but maybe it's 40, just arbitrarily. I say it's 40. And that group that's under 40 just loves controversy. Yeah. They love it. They want to see it. And when you see, Poilievre attacking Trudeau and Trudeau attacking Poilievre, and it's like, wow. And it's like, is anyone listening to what they're even talking about anymore? Or are they just there to point fingers and
just to watch the
entertaining?
Theater.
Yeah.
But for the rest of us, the theater, and to see some political discourse or some debate, but once it devolves into just theatrics and you're not even making intelligent arguments. And we've seen this on both sides of the two major parties here in Canada. For sure, we've seen it in the U.S., but where it just kind of gets down to name calling, and that's not helpful for anybody.
No, and it doesn't. Yeah, it doesn't move anything forward. It's just, I don't know. We spend an awful lot of money on those guys to sit there. And nothing's going forward.
And not only does it not move forward, but it can increase cynicism with the voters who increasingly detach from it and saying they're all a bunch of idiots. I'm detaching myself from political life and responsibilities we have as citizens, and that is to be engaged and to listen to the debates and to make reasonable decisions and choices on voting day. But if people say, well, they're all just kind of a bunch of clowns, I'm detaching myself, that's another sign that democracy is really in trouble.
Yeah, and and it's shocking to me that I think it is C-SPAN is the channel that the politics are on, and it's got much higher viewership than ever before ever. Like, we used to watch it to go to sleep, and now it's like an entertainment. It's kind of like Saturday Night Live during the day. Yeah, it's crazy.
It is.
So, yeah, but it's So Canada's fun. Alberta, where are we at in Alberta? What's your? Well, you've been in Alberta a long time.
My whole life. So I was grew up in Edmonton.
Yeah.
Born in Edmonton, raised in and around Edmonton. Did my first degree, my econ undergrad at the U of A.
We did it together. We'll say that.
And then I accidentally moved to Calgary in 1989. I say accidentally because it was for a summer job.
Yeah.
It was not expected to be permanent, but 36 years later, I'm still here. So I've lived my entire life in Alberta and have been a professional economist for roughly 30 of those years. And I've seen a lot of change and, recessions come and go. Since graduating, so I'm not even counting when I was a kid and not paying attention, but roughly since reaching adulthood after university, I've seen Alberta go through 6 major recessions.
Isn't that crazy?
It's crazy. 6.
Wow.
Yeah. Some of them more severe than others. The downturn of the 80s was very bad. But,
that was
COVID,
the NEP.
That was the
crisis,
NEP, but what happened in 2015, 2016 when oil prices collapsed, that was not a government-induced problem. It was just, oil prices, commodity prices collapsed.
8 and 9, the big financial crisis,
the
dot-com era.
Yeah. And now, so here we are on the cusp of 2025. Alberta, I would say, is in pretty good shape. Mm-hmm. Our unemployment rate is higher than the Canadian average, which isn't good. It's about 7.5%. It's too high. But a lot of that is because it's for, I guess, a happy reason, and that is that Alberta is attracting a lot of migrants, international and interprovincial. People are moving to Alberta, flocking to Alberta, in fact. On balance, that's good. It does keep the unemployment rate high. It creates a bit more competition if you're a job seeker, and that's maybe the not so comfortable part of it. If you're looking for a job in Alberta, the unemployment rate's 7.5%.
Yeah, that's high.
Yeah.
Do you know if we were to compare province to province on a per capita basis, do we know if Alberta's growing on a per capita basis faster than BC or
that's a really great question. I would say on a per capita basis, we are still growing. Our GDP is still expanding, just not as quickly as it would be if you just look at straight GDP.
Right.
Because, that, and the same thing is true sort of with Canada. Our overall real GDP has been kind of stuck, in second gear. Growing but stuck.
Right.
Per capita, it's now negative because Canada has been growing.
Right.
International migration to Canada has been really, really high over the last couple of years. And I never say that's a problem. I always like to say anyone who's moved to Canada is not a problem.
Yeah.
But it does create some challenge. Where do we house everybody? How do we, our productivity in Canada has been lagging. That means, are we falling behind in terms of creating new industries and new jobs that ultimately create wealth?
Yeah. Well, and I think, the history of immigration into Canada, it's been built on, having the right number and being thorough and, not just having an open border.
Right, yeah.
Like, it's still, we have a relatively close border. You still have to apply to get in.
Yeah, and we think about that principle even, you go to a hockey game. A lot of people are coming into that arena, but we do it in an orderly fashion, right? Yeah. Like, they don't just lift the lid off the saddle dome and everyone pours in.
Yeah.
You go through in lines and you file through, and eventually it fills up. So there's a lot of people coming in, but it's not like a free for all. You got to show a ticket.
Yeah, it is exciting to me that Alberta is growing, and it can't be growing because we remember back in the oil boom times, it was growing because we needed all these engineers and rig workers, and it was a very manual labor type environment. And even I remember this too, where there was large periods of time where Alberta companies were bringing in U.S. individuals because they were cheaper in many cases, and they had this expertise, and that's changed. I don't see as many of the U.S. people coming to Canada as used to be. But
well, and I think we still suffer some. Traditionally, we've suffered what we like to call brain drain to the United States. No, I don't know. That might change.
I think it's evolved.
It has evolved for sure. It always used to be, though, that if you were a trained professional like a nurse or something like that, you could make way more money.
Sure. Yeah.
So we would suffer this brain drain, and no one liked to see it. I don't begrudge anyone who did. I mean, they're trying to make a living and provide for their family and the opportunities, and the incomes can be higher down there. I always think there's more to where I want to live than just the paycheck I'm going to bring home.
That's right.
Is this the kind of country I want to live in? Is this a city where I find community?
Yeah.
And there are great cities and regions in the U.S. too. I don't want to imply otherwise. But what's happening now in the States, we might see maybe a bit more hesitation. We might see people that I want into that Trump America, and that might be a perspective. They might be able to make a pile of money. Yeah. Trump's going to deregulate, he says, a lot of things, cut taxes even further, kind of the Wild West. It might be a whole new golden age of capitalism in the U.S. Yeah. Or it could go the other way and turn into something a bit darker, where, it's easy if you're already rich to make even more money, but you might start to see the fabric of society kind of come apart. And then you question, do I want to live in a country that doesn't care for its most vulnerable, even though I'm now filthy rich?
Yeah.
That's an individual question that everyone sort of has to answer.
Yeah, that'll be interesting, and it'll be interesting to see if we can build metrics around it or something so we can even study it. It'll be fascinating. As you were talking about kind of that brain drain, one of the things that I think hasn't really hit any mainstream thinking is that as we've become more technologically advanced, I guess, and as jobs have become more technologically designed, there's a possibility, and we are seeing it in the IT world, where jobs like this is what I'm trying to say. An IT developer 15 or 20 years ago had this very elevated status. No one else could do it.
Yeah.
Suddenly, you can ship what they were doing to a foreign country that has incredibly low wages.
Yeah.
So the thing that we haven't really figured out yet is, if there's a job that someone's been doing for 10 years, should they have this almost a right to demand an increasing salary year over year over year? Or does technological requirements say, look, we're going to have to reevaluate the value of what you offer relative to this larger global economy?
Absolutely.
That's going to be interesting, because even, I don't know, I feel bad for the postal workers, but I don't get mail, I don't send mail. And it's like, and you're still demanding increases.
Yeah.
That's a tough argument.
And what you were just saying about, these highly trained, highly educated people in technical occupations, and can that be done more cheaply somewhere else? Or can ChatGPT do this?
Yeah, that's right.
Way faster and way cheaper, and in a lot of ways better.
Yeah.
And that's why, for the very first time, some very high income, high trained professions like accounting and law, they're finding their reckoning too.
Oh, really?
That everyone else has had to,
Wow.
experience in the past. How assembly line workers, so many of them lost their job to robotics in the 70s and 80s and 90s.
Yeah.
And now it's coming for the higher skilled, the knowledge workers that we used to think were impenetrable.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
But now ChatGPT can go through 800 pages of a legal document that would have taken, a paralegal or even a lawyer hours and hours and hours to pore over and now you load that into ChatGPT and it's done.
Wow.
So it's going to change the nature of those workers. I don't think they're going away, for the same reason that 40 years ago bank workers didn't go away when they brought in ATMs.
Right. Yeah,
Some
and everyone
people
thought they would.
Yeah, everyone thought, well, we can just get rid of all the bank workers. 40 years later, there's more people working for banks than there ever have been.
Wow.
But they're doing different things.
Yeah.
They're no longer just counting out the money.
Right.
Not very many of them are doing that. They're doing different things that an ATM machine couldn't do. More personal, relational, planning things around banking.
Yeah, it's like the banking has evolved too.
Yeah.
Like there's more banking.
Remember we used to line up for an hour on our lunch break,
Oh, yeah.
That was the only, and you had to fill out these deposit slips, and that was the only way you could do it.
Yeah.
And now, the world of banking, the banking industry is very, very different.
Yeah.
And online banking is
and
changing things
even
too.
the behind scenes is electronically advanced now. It used to be very physical, hauling things, dragging things around.
And there's more change. I mean, I spent 16 years of my life chief economist at a bank here in Alberta, and there's more things that are going to disrupt the world of banking in the future, especially when you look at things like, Apple offering banking services.
Are they really?
Yeah.
Wow,
They're starting to. And then, the question is, can a traditional bank, a medium-sized bank, and a regional bank in Canada, or even one of the large ones, RBC, and what are they offering to your regular consumer that Apple is not offering, or any of these other things? Neo Financial here, a Calgary company, a great example of they're disrupting the banking world.
Yeah, and they're making a big deal, and that's a big company now.
It really is. Yeah. But they've foregone all of the bricks and mortar that all these other banks spent 200 years building up.
Yeah.
And now they're kind of trying to figure out, what do we do with all this real estate that we don't necessarily need.
Yeah, that and real estate's an interesting thing in Calgary too, because we have lots of it downtown.
Lots of we're recording this podcast in a lot of vacancy.
Yeah, that hasn't. I think everyone was hoping it was going to correct. It hasn't fully. It hasn't corrected.
Not fully. No, it's slow.
Yeah.
I mean, it has come down. I think the peak was almost 30% vacancy, and now we're at about 20.
Yeah.
Might not have hit quite 30, but in some ways, we're finding more creative ways to fill some of this, what was commercial office space before. Calgary's been a real leader, I think, and an example for a lot of other cities in converting what was office space into residential. It doesn't work for every office building, but here we've got two problems. We've got too much office space, and we also don't have enough residential space for people to live in. So can we convert some of this? It doesn't happen overnight, but Calgary, I think, has set a really great example in some of the ways you can do it.
Yeah, and it's good that it hasn't happened overnight. Yeah. Because it's there's going to be some bumps on that road. Yeah. Like you need to build infrastructure to accommodate thousands and thousands of people showing up.
Yeah. And Calgary, downtown, and I know your listenership goes beyond Calgary. I don't want to be too focused on Calgary, but our downtown is about to go through a renaissance with some of the art and culture institutions. Mm-hmm. What's happening at Glenbow and also what's happening at Arts Commons.
What's going on at Glenbow?
Well, so
they did a big reno a few years back.
Well, it isn't open yet. So,
okay.
And I was on the board of Glenbow, so that's why I love to talk about Glenbow. They closed it just as the beginning of COVID. It was sort of coincidental, but we called it a reimagine of Glenbow. It was much more than it's not quite, a tear down and start a brand new building. We basically kept the skeleton of the building, but it is going to look very, very different than scheduled to open in 2026.
Okay, so another year.
It will not be your for people who grew up here, their dads or their grandpas. Yeah. Glenbow. It will be the kind of art experience that people. Well, you're an exception because for a city our size, we never really had a dedicated art museum that would draw people back continuously.
Now you went to the Getty Museum recently.
I did. I was in Los Angeles last week.
I do my research.
Yeah. I think I posted something on LinkedIn about it. J. Paul Getty donated what they assume to be about $1 billion. He bequeathed it to his children in the 90s when he died. And he was an art lover. Yeah. His children had all this money. And this is where I was really impressed, actually more of the story of what the kids did with this. Because they could probably have just lived their lives on yachts and,
sure, buy
spend
a boat
all this money, buy a boat. But But instead, they took this money and they turned Los Angeles into an arts center. It never really was on the art world before. I mean, LA was always Hollywood and
different art. Yeah.
But different art. Yeah. But it never had a dedicated, nothing of a world caliber. So they spent this money and built the Getty Center, which opened in 1997. It's more of a campus than a single building.
Yeah, okay.
But it's all kinds of buildings, not just art, but also a really great school for art restoration. People come from all over the world to study art restoration there.
Wow,
there's
that's really neat.
Performing arts. There's an auditorium and a theater. A lot of education that takes place there around art and culture. So it's more than just paintings on the wall, although there are buildings with paintings on the wall.
Yeah.
But it's much more than that. And I was just very impressed person J. Paul Getty can have. And best of all, it's free.
Yeah, that's
which
amazing.
Glenbow will be too when it reopens. Okay. And that was because of the gift of the Shaw family.
Oh, wow.
Making Glenbow and art in Calgary barrier-free, so it no longer will matter if you don't have the $16, which if you're taking a family, that's quite a lot of money.
Yeah.
It will be free, like the Getty Center and like a lot of museums in Europe and other places around the world, that public art should be accessible and free.
So is this a, and I agree, like Calgary, it's home for us, so it's always top of mind, but does something like the Glenbow put us on the map where we need to be? Because I feel like Calgary's we miss being on the map a lot.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's just like we're so close.
Well, I've always compared Calgary to, ever since the '88 Olympics, which really did vault Calgary into a different league of city. And I don't know if you're from Edmonton originally?
I was in Edmonton in '88, so I was still there.
Yeah, so was I. Yeah. We were both at the U of A then.
Yeah, that's right.
And I grew up in Edmonton, but we saw Calgary sort of vault ahead.
Yeah.
But it put it in a different category of city, and that is, I describe it as sort of that teenager. It thinks it's an adult, but you're not really quite an adult yet. Calgary tries really, really hard to be seen as a global city.
Right.
And in a lot of ways, we've done a great job. The fact that when the Economist magazine, they have these rankings, there's usually 4 cities in Canada, Toronto, Montreal, Vancouver, and they pick Calgary. For these global rankings, that we're in the club.
Yeah, we're in the magazine finally.
We're on the Economist list. Edmonton's not on the list. Ottawa's not on the list. There's only 4 cities. So we like to view ourselves as a global city, but this also creates a bit of sort of nervous energy sometime in Calgary that I don't always love. We're really worried about what did the New York Times say about us, or what do people in Toronto think about us, sort of like that pimply-faced 14-year-old who gets to go to an adult party, sits at the adult table for the first time, and is kind of, awkward and maybe a bit self-conscious about doing the right thing. Whereas Edmonton, because, and I say this with love for my hometown of Edmonton, Edmonton's not in the same league of city, but it has left Edmonton much more comfortable in its own skin. It doesn't really care that much about what people in Toronto or London or Sydney, Australia. They don't care.
No.
Edmonton's doing its own thing, and we like Edmonton, and they're kind of weird and wacky, and it's arts and heavy industry and gritty and political and all these things, but it's less consumed by what other people think about it. Because Calgary is in a different category, we worry about it here more.
Yeah, we have the Global Petroleum Show every couple of years, which is terrific. But Edmonton has the Fringe Festival, and that's pretty terrific as well.
It is, and that's exactly something that was kind of homegrown in Edmonton.
Yeah.
And I don't know if a lot of your listeners have been to it. It's fringe theater, meaning, and I go to the Fringe almost every year. But
it's amazing.
It's amazing, but you can see some real garbage there
Yeah,
too.
that's right.
Well, it's experimental.
Right.
And that's the nature of it. And even people from the Fringe, if they were here, they're not trying to be the Stratford Festival.
Right, exactly.
They are the Fringe Festival. Some of this is going to work. Some of it's going to be the worst 2 hours of your life. Some of it is going to change your mind and blow your mind. And everything in between. That's the nature of experimental theater.
And in some ways, it kind of underlines what you're saying, because Edmonton just doesn't care.
It doesn't care.
Like, whatever.
No,
we're doing it.
Our
We
own
love
thing.
it. Yeah.
Whereas in Calgary, and maybe because, and I've been involved in several arts organizations here in Calgary, maybe because there is a bit more corporate sponsorship of things.
Right.
Calgary is a little bit, despite our 2 weeks of wildness during the rodeo, I mean, people really cut loose. But the rest of the time, we're a little more cautious, I think. Maybe a little more concerned about what does the corporate sponsor think about, this play we're putting on. Is it too cutting edge? Is it, are we going to lose some sponsorship? I think there is still a little bit of that in Calgary that, and I don't want to say it's comparing apples to oranges, because I don't want to say Calgary is not an arts center. It really is. Yeah. It's just a different mood and a different vibe than art and culture in Edmonton.
Yeah. To me, it's quite interesting when you contrast how the Stampede is run, and then Klondike Days 2 weeks later with the exact same rides. Like, it's the same, but it just misses out on this other flavor. But Edmonton has always been in the, I don't care, or whatever. We're just having this great thing for a week. It's terrific. So.
And I think there is probably some jealousy in Edmonton. I mean, they look at Calgary and the Stampede. Like, any city our size would love to have the Calgary Stampede as a marketing, no matter what people say about, we're more than cowboy hats, and I get it. I'll put on a cowboy hat during Stampede, but that's the only time of year. Yeah. But it's just fun, and it's an amazing branding opportunity for a city our size. We punch up far above our weight. Again, we're seen more as that global city than a city like Edmonton or Winnipeg or Ottawa, similar size cities.
Yeah. I've waffled back and forth on Stampede, and I thought it's like business-wise, it's a disruptor in it. Yeah. Like, it shuts everyone down for a week, maybe 2 weeks. But then on the other hand, I'm like, this is amazing for the city.
Oh, it really is.
We should make it go for 2 weeks or 3 weeks or whatever. But
I'm the opposite. I'm thinking maybe we should do this once every 4 years, kind of like the Olympics or the World Cup. I don't know. I find it a lot, but that's a minority opinion. Yeah. Calgarians love their Stampede, and I love it too. And I've loved watching the Stampede, and I don't know if this is intentional or not. The rodeo remains sort of a core piece of it. Yeah. But it's now more the Calgary Music Festival, like the music they're bringing in. Yeah. It seems to be that's where the emphasis of growth seems to be, around the musical acts that are coming in, and not just the ones on the grounds on the Coca-Cola stage and in the Saddle Dome, but all these other music venues like the Cowboys Music Festival that they have, and all these others. There's a lot of really big names, and not just country music.
No,
it's
all
everything. Genres.
Yeah,
of music.
That's right.
It seems to be turning more into a music festival, and there's also a rodeo. Yeah. I don't know if this is intentional, and I don't know if this is maybe where they see the growth in the future of the Stampede. It's maybe not around the rodeo and chuck wagon.
Agricultural.
Yeah, I mean, that I think will always be a piece of it. But I don't know. From an outsider looking in, I just see more emphasis and more growth around bringing people together around music. Yeah. And I think it's great.
Yeah, it's a huge event. Whatever else
it's massive.
It has so much attached to it. And you're right, where you can say, hey, this person's performing, but now you have to ask where, because it's not always going to be right there. Yeah, that's really interesting.
There's all these different venues.
Yeah, and there's big venues, and like some of the big venues that are all across Calgary are so huge. Yeah. Like, they really are big. They're big events.
And the National Music Center has kind of flown under the radar.
It really has, I agree.
I think it has been instrumental in solidifying Calgary's identity as a music city. My pal Andrew Moskar, who heads up the National Music Center, he's worked, I've known him for probably 30 years. He's worked on establishing Calgary, and he's a displaced Montrealer. Yeah. Right? But he says, the city has nothing to be shy about when it comes to our musical history, not just country music, but, in the presence of the National Music Center here in Calgary and the fact that our Stampede celebration is becoming more well-rounded with more music. I think it's great. Sort of like what Austin did with the South by Southwest Music Festival.
Yeah, that's right.
It's put it on the map too.
I think it'll be, an interesting shift at some point when, like, a lot of people that come here from overseas, they're either coming for the Stampede event or they're going to Banff.
Yeah.
And they're not, like, Calgary hasn't quite made that transition to where you come to Calgary because it's got this massive, like, you go to Vegas because it's Vegas.
Yeah.
Right? You don't go to Vegas to go to the Hoover Dam.
Right.
So, like, we need people to come to Calgary because there's so much to do here, and then we need to get that message out.
Well, and I think we're becoming that.
Yeah,
again,
I agree.
The reimagined Glenbow and Arts Commons, which will be, by the time it's done, the single largest investment in art and culture facility in Canada's history.
Is that right? Wow.
So we have nothing to be shy about comparing ourselves to Toronto or Montreal or Vancouver. In the arts and culture, we have arrived. And I think once these venues open, the National Music, the Glenbow Reimagined and the Arts Commons, I think Calgarians will start to really understand, this is not my grandpa's, city that offered really not much more than a rodeo and fly fishing, right?
Yeah.
And we still offer that. And
we still have that.
We still have that, and that's going to be a piece of it, but we're much bigger. And I think that will make it a lot easier for Tourism Calgary to say, hey, tourists from out of the country, on your way out to Banff, why don't you also spend 2 or 3 or 4 days in Calgary, because it's an amazing city to visit on its own.
That's what made me concerned/worried that we were just going to build this high-speed rail from the airport terminal straight to Banff. We were just going to completely bypass Calgary.
Yeah.
It's like, not sure how that's great. But.
And the other question is, can we even squeeze any more visitors into Banff?
Yeah, that's right. I think they're tapped out at this point.
Well, they're tapped out. Yeah. I've been advocating, and this is maybe a little off the subject that we're on, but I've been advocating that it's time for Alberta to develop more of its crown land and develop more and new mountain resort areas for visitors. Banff is full. That poor city, it cannot take any more.
No, it's so bad. And even when you go to Lake Louise and you have to take a bus. What is that? It's so complicated.
And the visitor experience is no longer great. It's ecologically causing a lot of problem.
Yeah.
That many people cramming into a parking lot at Lake Louise. But we can't be marketing Alberta globally and saying, come and see our mountains. And then when they get here, tell them, oh, sorry, you can't actually go there today.
Or take a ticket. You see when your turn is.
Or take a ticket or a lottery or something. And we can't really allow hotels in Banff to be $1,000 a night because there's no more possible expansion.
Yeah.
Leaving maybe an international visitor can pay $1,000 at the Banff Springs.
Yeah.
But where does that leave Albertans, the general Albertan, that cannot, they're not going to spend $1,000. They can't.
No.
For one night in their own backyard, seeing their own mountains.
Yeah. And, you're right. We have such an expanse of opportunity to develop. It's massive.
It's been almost 50 years. The last development was Kananaskis country.
Yeah.
1978. That isn't really, there is a nice hotel and conference center there, but it's not a major center, When you look at some of, say for example, how they built up Whistler over the last 30 years, or even places west of Denver in around Breckenridge, Colorado, and Aspen. And I'm sure there's lessons to be learned and things that those regions wish they had done differently in the development of these areas that we can learn from here in Alberta. But I think we need to be purposeful about more development. But I would add a huge asterisk. It can't just be fling the doors open to developers. This has to be done in a smart way around the environment, the sustainability of our environment. What I would love to see is Alberta being held up as the example around the world for how to both respect the environment but also draw tourism and create opportunity, economic opportunity. I think the two can go hand in hand, but it has to be intentional.
Yeah. I think a lot of the oil and gas companies, they take a lot of heat, but at the same time, and, because there probably were the ones that were causing a lot of environmental issues, but at the same time, they've invested very heavily in being environmentally conscious now, and we can lean on that. Yeah. That's a great thing.
And that's such an interesting conversation going on in Calgary right now because, and maybe being from here and having spent 36 years in Calgary, I get it, what the oil and gas companies are doing, what they're trying to do. I also see why there is some skepticism from people from outside of Calgary who don't live here, who don't have friends who work for these companies, who don't know personally some of the senior executives who are making these decisions. They just see this as greenwashing. They just see this as all a bunch of lies. Don't believe for a second what any of these oil and gas executives are telling you. But it's because they don't know them personally.
Yeah, that's right.
Most of us in Calgary, we know people. We all probably have a friend or a relative or somebody who works for these companies.
Yeah.
They don't want to destroy the planet any sooner than I do.
Nope.
They are trying to make changes. They also understand we can't just turn off oil and gas right now. That's not a practical solution. All the people flying in their planes to these, conferences, these climate conferences, none of them are riding their bikes there. Maybe Greta Thunberg might. I mean, if one person's going to ride her bike, it's going to be Greta Thunberg.
Yeah.
But everyone else are flying in their planes. The irony seems to be lost on them. And I am, solidly in the camp of we need to act, and we need to act fast and urgently on climate change. Yeah. But I also see the energy companies as they're a big part of the solution.
Yeah.
And just 100%. Shutting them down isn't going to, it's not going to work.
Well, it's economics, right?
It's economics.
You take out something else is going to replace it.
Yeah.
It might not be as good.
Yeah.
Yeah. That could be a huge problem. And, this is outside really what we're talking about, but you can't, I don't know how many physical homes are in Alberta, but you can't tomorrow say, look, there's no more natural gas to heat your houses. We're going to have to convert you to electrical. And
right.
It's like, this is not going to happen.
No.
It's impossible. It would take decades to get that to go.
Yeah. So instead, we work with the oil and gas companies to find incremental ways, but do it, in a way that is sensible, that still makes money, but also moves the needle on our carbon intensity. And I don't think, actually, we're ever going to stop producing oil and gas. We might find other ways to sequester carbon. This carbon... what do they call it? The
carbon capture.
Carbon capture and storage, but also direct carbon capture from the air.
Okay.
The technology is very expensive, and most of it doesn't work. But that's the beginning of every technology.
You got to learn. Yeah.
You got to learn. And it's, I think, far too soon to just write off these technologies that are hugely expensive and mostly don't work. Let's see what they look like in 10 years.
Yeah, that's right.
Just like any technology.
Well, you and I would remember back, and young people don't remember, but when the oil sands was first being developed, they had this huge issue of how are we ever going to get the oil out of the sand?
Yeah, that's right. And I'm sure at the time there were people saying, you guys are nuts. This is never going to work. This is never going to be commercially viable.
Yep.
And in the 50s and 60s, when they were developing it, it wasn't. But enough people, including the provincial government, had enough vision for what the oil sands could become that eventually, and with the right price signals, the price of oil had to come up, but also the technology improved so much and efficiencies increased, costs come down, and now we're a world leader in it.
Yeah, it's amazing. Yeah. And thank goodness the U.S. needs heavy oil.
That's right. That is one card that, we have a few cards to play against Mr. Trump, but one of them is, you still need heavy oil because you are going to have a mutiny on your hands with your energy sector if you slap on a 10 or 20% tariff on Canadian heavy oil coming in, because they do need it. They can't substitute something else.
Can we shut off the tap on our fresh water too? Does that help?
Ooh, that's a more complicated. That is,
Yeah.
and I don't know. I haven't looked at that issue a
Yeah.
lot, but there are some people that's really
That's
what they're
a
worried
big deal
about.
to some people.
Yeah.
But I don't know anything
And
about
and
it.
Trump might say, okay, look, Canada, I'll forego the 10% tariff, but we can help ourselves to all the fresh water. What are we going to say? I don't know.
Yeah.
I don't know the answer to that question. Water is a commodity unlike any other,
Yeah.
right? Because it's the one thing. We don't actually even need oil, but you need water. You need
Yeah.
fresh water. We're dead in 4 days without it.
Yeah, and we can pay to have it desalinized, but it's very expensive.
That's right. And we have an abundance of fresh water, and America's looking for solutions. I don't know. I haven't heard Mr. Trump speak about
Yeah, I
fresh
haven't
water,
either. That was interesting.
but it might be something he might bring to that
Yeah.
transactional negotiation that he's famous for.
And maybe like I don't want to abandon this one thought we were talking about earlier was this disruption idea of like, and that's something that you're talking about a lot. So like maybe lead us into that. What is the disruption concept now?
Yeah, so my talks that I'm giving these days are really focused far less on economic forecast. And that's a shift for me. I've spent 30 years of my life, preparing economic forecasts and working with econometric models and putting together these forecasts. And I would traipse around the province and the country and the world, talking about here's the forecast, here's what's going to happen. Maybe it's a stage of life thing, I don't know, but I'm just kind of saying this is all sort of useless. The forecast is going to be wrong. And it's not because we're getting bad at the math. It's the world moves too quickly. And we are so integrated and so much volatility. When I was, making forecasts at ATB Financial, we used to joke that the secret to good forecasting is revise frequently. And that way, you're never really wrong,
Yeah,
right?
that's right.
You can just say, well, that was yesterday's forecast, and we have a new one.
New variables.
New variables, And if you revise it every single day, it kind of lays bare how foolish any of this exercise is.
Yeah.
So rather than trying to do an economic forecast, I'm trying to help audiences prepare for anything that could happen. Because if there's anything certain in the world, is that there's going to be disruption.
Right.
A lot of it may be unpleasant. And our industries, our businesses, our individuals here in Canada, anywhere, are we preparing for any number of these disruptions? We don't know what they look like.
Right.
Sure, we can look at the scenarios and say this is maybe a bit more likely, but the reality is anything could happen. COVID should have taught us that.
Oh, yeah.
And we hope we don't live through another thing like COVID, but I think that was the biggest, no one really predicted that. I'm sure you can find one person who wrote a paper.
Nostradamus probably said something.
Somebody probably did. But generally speaking, and when it hit the world, we were unprepared for it.
Yeah.
So how can we live in a world now where rather than getting sort of intellectually stuck on one forecast, some economist presents, how do I know what's going to happen? Rather than that, let's spend more time and effort trying to prepare for any number of things that come our way. And that's really the message in my economic presentations that I'm giving these days.
Yeah, you make a really interesting point. You think back to even our university days, and we said, all right, we're going to have a whole class on Marxism, and then we're going to have a class on, Keynesian economics, and then, something else. And they were packaged up as these large leviathans, to use that term, of things that would just kind of roll along and be relatively unchanging. But you're right, it's like, man, you can't predict anything now.
No.
It's crazy.
And even sort of the geopolitics, who would have thought?
Yeah.
Even a few years ago, who would have thought we'd been in the situation where, and again, people will have different views on Mr. Trump, but this is happening kind of around the world. We're seeing a kind of a decline in what we used to think of as the democratic process, more autocracy, more of these, I alone can fix this kind of leaders, personalities. We're seeing this we saw this in Brazil, we saw this, and we're seeing this in Hungary, in the United States, China, India. So it's not isolated to some fluke thing that's happened in the United States.
Yeah. Wow.
But
So when we look at the kind of the micro level now is how disruption's happening and the aftermath of the COVID aftermath, and we're heavily, into the staffing and employment world.
Yeah.
And it's like, wow, we almost can't put our finger on the change. What is the change? And so I don't know. What are you seeing? Human-wise, and what we're experiencing now?
Well, I think and this is only one of the shadow effects that COVID had is completely detaching what was left of this idea of the geography of work. Where does work happen? Mm-hmm. This was already happening before COVID, more remote working and people working from home, and the technology was enabling them to do that. But COVID really pushed that into hyperdrive. Yeah. And now I know all kinds of businesses, they're having a devil of a time getting people to physical work in an office because a lot of people don't see any need for it. Yeah. And I did almost all of my work during COVID at home. I wasn't traveling, which is something I normally would have been. I was doing all virtual. And I got to say, there are some benefits to that for sure. But there's a piece of me, and maybe it's because I'm nostalgic, I kind of miss the office environment. The TV show The Office? Yeah. We watched that during COVID, all 9 seasons of it. That office environment, it's gone, and it's not coming back. And I don't want to be so silly as to say we need to bring back that kind of office environment because it's not coming back. But there was a kind of personal, human, relational thing, and that was what the TV show that The Office was about, this love-hate relationships that all these crazy characters had. It doesn't exist anymore. And it's hard to replicate that on Zoom calls and working remotely. For sure, there's a lot of advantages with remote working. I think even a lot of cities have just seen rush hour traffic not as big an issue as it used to be because you're not trying to plow 80,000 people into 12 square blocks of real estate in half an hour every morning, because there's more flex, and there's a benefit to that. Yeah.
I think a lot of times, in the human experiences, we do see this overreaction curve, so we see, these businesses couldn't have people working in the office. It wasn't an option.
Right. Yeah.
And so then they say, okay, everyone has to work from home. And then now we're coming back to work, and you got a number of individuals saying, I'm going to work from home. It's like, and the businesses are saying it's not an option anymore. So you got to choose. So, well, even I think Musk was saying that in some of his business, like you come back to work or you're not working here any longer.
Yeah. And that's a position some companies can make. Yeah. I think it might come at the risk of losing some really good talent because some people just aren't going to play by that rule. Yeah. But some companies, depending on the nature of the work too,
Sure, of course. There's not a lot of roofers that work from home.
That's right.
It's just reality.
And for healthcare workers or retail workers, food and accommodation, they've never been able to work from home. Yeah. It's really only these office workers. And sometimes us office workers, we tend to think this is everybody.
Yeah.
It's not.
It's not everybody. Yeah.
No.
Yeah. Yeah. And I've said this before too. I think that there's and it's part of this overcorrection into things where I think workers who demand work from home that experience need to be very cautious that they don't get outsourced.
Yeah.
And that's a risk you run,
because it's probably easier for a manager to outsource the people they've never met.
Well, if your job can be done fully remote, why do we need to have you in an environment where you're getting paid what we pay people here in Calgary?
Right. Yeah.
So there's cheaper places. There's cheaper people.
I think we're in
economics.
I love this concept of the liminal space. You're moving from one state of existence into something else. The something else has not yet arrived. Yeah. But this liminal space that we're going through, and a lot of different things, economics, politics, social, cultural, the liminal space often feels awkward. It feels uncertain. We've seen the past kind of in the rear view mirror. Some of us maybe want that office environment back. Others are eager to move. But in that liminal space, there's always some confusion, and it can be emotional for people. And I think that's one of the things in the wake of COVID, the work environment, in North America, Europe for sure, this idea of where does work happen and when does it happen? It used to be that old model. It was Monday to Friday, 8 to 5. And it
Yeah.
happened at this cubicle. And
Yeah.
that was the only place it could possibly happen.
Yeah. Because you couldn't afford to buy your own computer device.
Well,
or whatever
no, because
it amounted to.
the CPU, was that what it's called? The computer tower, sat in my cubicle in an office downtown. I could maybe at best take home some reading if I had to do, but work took place in one spot, and that was in the office in the cubicle.
It's now this, I think, and I have some kids that they're university age, and so it's the new social challenge of getting the kids to understand that they do need to be productive, not just have a job. It's not good enough just to burn off 40 hours a week, sitting there doing nothing. You do actually have to produce. And when you're working from home, that's how you're measured. You're not going to get measured by your computer's light is on and then it's off 8 hours later.
Right.
There has to be something happening.
Yeah. And I think there's a challenge on the other side for, I know one, I'll not name the company, but their president, he marched everyone back to the office, and no exceptions, because in his mind, if he can't see them, they're not working.
Right.
So he could walk down the aisle, sort of like C. Montgomery Burns, like this very old style of management, and he's going to walk down the office, and I can see all the heads in the cubicles, and I can see them, but are they really working?
Yeah.
Are they doing anything productive?
Yeah.
They might be shopping online. You don't know.
Yeah.
If you walk right by their computer, sure, they can pull up a,
Sure.
an Excel screen or something. We've all played this game, right? Just because you can see them sitting in their cubicle doesn't mean they're being productive.
Right.
So there's that error too. But I think ultimately, as we move through this liminal space, there's going to have to be a new kind of model of work that will negotiate between the worker and the bosses or the supervisors. When does this work get done? What does being in person mean? How do we value that? And again, for certain industries, it might mean more than something else.
Yeah.
But I think you're entirely right. Anybody who thinks they can just work at home all the time, they better watch out, because that might be the very first thing that we outsource.
Well, yeah, and I think too, you severely restrict your opportunity to lead people when you're distant from them.
Yeah,
it's doable for sure, but it's really difficult if you can't kind of be with your team and march with them. So
and even sharing those human stories, we all we use the colloquial term, the water cooler conversations now, that generally don't relate to work. Sometimes they do, but often it's like, oh, did you, what did you do on the weekend? Or, here's what it's learning about people and building those human connections.
Yeah, it makes team building really different if you have a widely distributed staff. I don't know how you do a team building event.
And we tried a lot of that during COVID, because I was on a team of about 9, spread between different parts of the province. And we tried really hard to do, I think we called it Thursday afternoon cocktail hour. But
would you go on Zoom and drink cocktails
really
on
did,
Zoom?
or coffee, or whatever was your drink of choice. It didn't need to be a cocktail.
That is awesome.
We tried really hard. We're going to set aside 4 to 5 o'clock.
Yeah.
And we're just going to all be on this Zoom call, and we're not going to talk about work. And we had this little thing where it was sort of show and tell, except someone's going to present some of their photos from the last holiday they took. Hopefully not every photo, but maybe 4 or 5 of the best shots, and they're going to tell us about their holiday. It worked for a while, but I gotta admit, as people got busy, it got too easy to drop out, and then the whole thing kind of petered out.
Wow. Of the things that peter out in this world, one of them is the way people dress properly.
Oh.
Which is interesting, and we had talked about this before, so it's not a new topic. But I saw was it yesterday or the day before, this massive decline in some of the luxury brand sales.
Yeah, right.
Like Christian Dior is really struggling. There's a bunch of them that people are just they're abandoning buying expensive things anymore because they can wear sweats, I guess, all day.
Yeah.
So.
Some of this, I think, is maybe a reckoning that needed to happen. I think some of it is generational. Mm-hmm. I'm not an expert on generations, but the Gen Zs,
whatever it is
that what we call them now?
The most current.
Or the Gen Alpha, I don't know what we call them. They're a lot of them are
Yeah.
far less interested in material things than they are in experience. So for them, why on earth are they going to buy a Chanel bag?
Yeah.
That's not all of them. Some of them really, really
Yeah,
want
yeah.
a Chanel bag,
Yeah.
you know. But that was more my generation because we were in the wake of sort of the Great Depression generation. My mother and father were born during the Great Depression. They were babies. But they carried with them kind of that Depression mentality that was all about saving. And, you know, there's a lot of virtue in that.
Yeah.
You know, you save before you buy something.
Yeah, our parents would be the same age. My dad used to, after dinner, he would wash the tinfoil and fold it up and reuse it.
My grandmother, she used to save the string. You know when you get like a roast or something?
Oh, my goodness, really?
And she would save the string and wash it out. And at one point I asked her, you know, and this would have been like probably in the 80s when she didn't need to be doing this anymore.
Yeah.
She said, well, I can, she would tie them all together and she'd make pot scrubbers, which probably in 1948, maybe you really needed that.
Before Dollarama opened.
Yeah, and you couldn't just go and buy a plastic, you know, a scrubby. But she was resourceful. And she was still in the habit of doing this, even though by the 80s she would have had a plastic scrubby. But she was still doing this.
Wow.
You know, the new generations, you know, so then there's you and I that maybe grew up in the 70s and 80s, and we carried, you know, that was still sort of part of our culture. But material things are maybe not as important. And there's a part of me, I'm actually a little bit jealous of these newer generations that are more interested in experience and not a Chanel bag.
Yeah.
You know?
Yeah.
And I think that might be one of the reasons why some of these luxury brands are in trouble.
Yeah. Yeah. And, you know, and I guess it opens the door to, you know, a complexity of, or a wide range of systems. You know, I might like a nice bag. You might like a nice jacket or a shirt, and someone else wants to go on vacation. So I think it's opened the door a little bit.
It really has, yeah. And I know I like, you know me, I like kind of dressing nicely. It doesn't mean dressing expensively. I think there's a real difference between that. Just because I like looking nice, it doesn't mean that my shoes are $1,000, you know.
Yeah.
And sometimes in the past, people have criticized me because sometimes on my LinkedIn, just for fun, every couple of weeks or so, I'll post something about men's footwear.
Yeah.
Just, you know, because they're popular.
Yeah.
They kind of blow up on LinkedIn, and everyone's all of a sudden, they're not that interested in my post yesterday on the economy. But, you know, talking about men's shoes, people, they get right into it. But there's some people that get a little cranky, and they're like, why on earth are you talking about such a trivial, stupid topic of shoes? Isn't there bigger things in the world? And I always answer back, trying in kindness to say, you know what, there are a lot of things going on right now, and they are important. But maybe precisely because of that, we need a break. And can't we just talk once, you know, every couple of weeks about something trivial like men's footwear?
An argument for levity. So
for levity. Yeah. Does everything need to be so serious? And
yeah, and it totally goes that way. I think what's I find interesting from an employer's perspective is that I think employers still respect people that, you know, and you're right, you don't have to be wearing a $2,000 suit and, you know, wildly expensive shoes, but they appreciate someone who makes an effort.
Yes, they do.
And maybe that's all it is. You know, just make an effort, dress properly, do a little bit of research, what's appropriate to wear.
Well, even just clean.
Yeah,
you know?
yeah.
And maybe this is why I'm particularly on footwear, because I'll see, you know, men downtown Calgary or Toronto or wherever, and they're wearing these great suits, but they drop the ball.
Yeah.
Their shoes look like you've been wearing these since high school grad.
Yeah.
You know, they're beat up, they're not clean, they're all scuffed, they're almost falling apart.
Yeah.
And again, you don't need to spend $1,000 on shoes, but you need to keep them in good condition and clean them.
Yeah.
I don't know.
Like I remember back when I was quite young, there was, I don't know, it was probably in a magazine because there was no internet. and people would say, look, when you're out dating, a woman's going to look at your shoes, and that's how they're going to determine who you are.
And an employer will look at shoes too, or they should be looking at shoes. When I always used to hire people, not that I would judge them entirely, but it's a little piece of information about, you know, what does this person maybe think about themselves. And
and if you join the military, you're going to shine shoes.
Well, and there's
That's
a reason.
what you do for a living.
Yeah, there's a reason for that too.
And it's this. Yeah, it's a show of respect for taking care of things that you have responsibility over.
Yeah.
So,
and some of the other, the pushback people on social media, and I should make it clear, by far those are the minority of people.
They might just be trolling you back, so just to have fun.
They might be. But they're saying, looks don't matter, and I'm going to wear what I want, and I don't care what anyone thinks about me. Fair enough, if that's their position. But for many of the rest of us, especially if you are young, you're starting your career, you might not like it, but we do live in a world where first impressions at least mean something. It doesn't need to mean everything, right?
Yeah.
The character of a person obviously means far more. But if you're going on a date for the first time, if you're meeting that girl or that guy's parents for the first time, you want to be on your A game, right?
Put in some effort.
Put in a little bit of effort. Yeah. That's all it is.
I feel like there's been this overcorrection. We do this as humans, I guess, where, we say at one level, it's like Instagram, it's all about comparison. And then you have this overcorrection crowd that says, I'm never going to compare myself, and I'm perfect the way I am, and I'm just not going to care about anything. And then I think they miss the mark. The other people miss the mark, and somewhere in the middle is probably a safe place to be.
Yeah.
So, you have to compare. If you don't, you don't know if you're doing well.
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah.
And even for what I would call maybe middle-aged or older people like me, and a lot of them are the ones saying, I don't care what I look like. If I'm not good enough showing up in, my fleece vest and my Western boots, and that's okay. Fleece vests and Western boots can be a really great look, again, if they're clean. But it's a sign of respect for other people. Even if I don't need to be dating or I'm not out for a job because I'm retired, you show up to an event, and it's a sign of respect to the people around you that you at least put in a little bit of effort in the way you appear. You don't need to go overboard, but just think about it. Respect the people around you.
I don't know if you've seen the movie. I think it's called The Irishman. It's a fairly new one. It's out on Netflix.
Okay.
Really long. It's a mob movie, and it's actually really good. I was really quite impressed. And just speaking to that point, the main character goes to a meeting at a restaurant, and the guy who meets him shows up in essentially it was like a short sleeve bowling shirt and shorts. And the guy was so offended that he would not be wearing a suit to a meeting. You wear a suit to a meeting. It's what just happened here. So it was interesting. It was a time thing. I don't think it would be appropriate to show up in a golf shirt. Anyway, so.
Well, and for every situation, there's a situation where a nice trim golf shirt, clean.
Sure, 100%.
That's what you want to be wearing.
And to show up in a suit would seem completely off.
You wouldn't show up, wouldn't show up maybe at a golf course.
Yeah.
That's maybe an obvious example.
Yeah.
But there's a time and place for everything. I always like to be just maybe one notch over, especially if I don't know exactly the situation, and often because I'm the invited speaker. I don't want to be wearing a tuxedo in a room where everyone is in, and I've made that mistake before, maybe not a tuxedo, but I've been way overdressed. Back in the days, I would be driving out to rural Alberta. I remember one particular, I was in Lac La Biche, which is way up north, and I looked fantastic. I was wearing this very beautiful wool suit, an Italian tie, probably Italian dress shoes. I looked like a jackass in that room because it was not appropriate. Well, then there was 4 feet of snow. People literally came to the event on skidoos, in skidoo suits, and they're the people who were dressed appropriately for this. I was not. I was not really showing them respect.
Yeah.
Maybe I didn't want to wear a skidoo suit, but I could really have brought this way, way down and actually showed more respect for them and still look good and still be dressed well and dressed appropriately.
It's a learning thing. We learn it. We figure it out as we go. I've been called out on what I was wearing a few times. It doesn't feel very good, but that's the thing.
So, we learn.
Yeah, that's part of it. Yeah. Well, listen, I know we have other things to do today, but thanks for coming.
This has been a lot of fun. I think we could probably have kept going for a whole other hour.
We'll start talking about school and forever. So, but so great having you, and we'll for sure get together again, and we'll do more.
Thank you so much.
The world changes. There's lots to talk about.
There is, and 2025 is right on our doorstep, so there's going to be a lot to talk about.
All right. Well, thanks, Todd.
Thank you for having me.
All right. Thanks.